The protagonist had always known something wasn't quite right with their family, but it wasn't until adulthood that they truly began to understand the depth of the dysfunction. Growing up, there were moments that seemed normal, family dinners, birthday celebrations, holidays. But as time passed, it became clear that these were just fleeting moments, brief windows of happiness that didn't last. The reality of their relationship with their parents was anything but warm or loving. From a young age, the protagonist could sense that they were never the priority. Their parents, particularly their father, always seemed distant, as if their love and attention were reserved for someone else. This became even more apparent as the protagonist grew older and began to recognize the patterns in their family dynamic. There was favoritism, clear, unmistakable favoritism toward the other siblings, with the protagonist always feeling like an afterthought. Flashbacks from childhood kept coming back to haunt the protagonist. The times when they'd sit at the dinner table, trying to impress their father, but it was always their sibling who got the praise, while their efforts went unnoticed. It was the quiet rejection, the way their parents would shut down any of their dreams or ambitions with casual dismissiveness. The protagonist's heart would ache, but they learned to suppress those emotions. After all, wasn't this how families were supposed to be? Weren't they supposed to be there for you, even when they were distant? But no matter how hard they tried, the protagonist couldn't shake the feeling that their parents weren't truly on their side. The endless criticisms, the subtle jabs at their achievements or personality, the sense that nothing they did would ever be good enough, it all began to wear them down. It wasn't just neglect, it was emotional manipulation. Their parents would play the victim, turning everything back on the protagonist. If they questioned their parents' behavior, they were accused of being ungrateful. If they stood up for themselves, they were labeled as rebellious or disrespectful. When the protagonist grew older and had children of their own, they hoped that things might change. Perhaps their parents, now grandparents, would soften. Perhaps they would show up, offer their support, and make up for the years of emotional neglect. It was a naive hope, but one that still lingered despite everything. The protagonist wanted to believe that deep down their parents still cared. The birth of their child was supposed to be the moment when things could finally heal, when the bond of family could strengthen. But as the child's first birthday approached, that old fear began to creep in again. The protagonist hesitated, torn between wanting to maintain familial ties and knowing, deep down, that they were fooling themselves. Should they extend the invitation to their parents, or would it just open old wounds? After all, their parents had shown little interest in their child up to this point. The protagonist had tried to include them, to get them involved, but their parents remained distant. It seemed as though they only cared about the things that benefited them, and this new chapter of the protagonist's life didn't fit into their narrow vision of what mattered. The real blow came when, just days before the birthday celebration, the protagonist's father made his feelings clear. In a cold, detached voice, he said, "We won't recognize this grandchild." The words hung in the air, slicing through the protagonist like a sharp knife. There was no remorse in his voice, no regret, just a statement of finality. It was as though their child, their flesh and blood, didn't matter at all. The protagonist was left speechless, staring at the phone in disbelief, not knowing how to respond. Inside, they felt a mix of anger and sadness, but it was quickly overshadowed by a quiet realization. The realization that they had spent far too long hoping for something that would never come. They had been chasing the approval of people who didn't care, and this was the moment when they had to let go. The emotional conflict within them was overwhelming. Part of them still wanted to fight for their parents' love, but another part of them was tired. Tired of the constant disappointment. Tired of the emotional games. Tired of being the one who always reached out, only to be met with indifference. As the birthday drew closer, the protagonist couldn't shake the feeling that this was the end of an era. They had tried for so long to make things work, but the constant pain of rejection was no longer something they could bear. It was time to put up boundaries, time to walk away, not in anger, but in quiet dignity. In that moment, the protagonist understood that letting go wasn't just about severing ties with their parents. It was about reclaiming their own life, their own happiness. The days leading up to the first birthday of the protagonist's child had been a whirlwind of preparation. There was an overwhelming sense of excitement in the air, not just for the child, but for the protagonist, too. This was a milestone, a moment they had long dreamed of, a celebration of life and love that they could finally share with their little one. The decorations were a labor of love, each balloon, each ribbon, carefully placed, reflecting a small piece of the joy that had taken over their life since becoming a parent. The cake, sweet and rich, was ordered from a local bakery, and the guest list had been made up of close friends, people who had been there for the protagonist through thick and thin. The anticipation was palpable. The protagonist had dreamed of this moment for years, the first real family celebration that included their child. But even more than that, they had hoped that their own parents would be there. Perhaps it was naive, but the protagonist held on to the hope that this new chapter would bring reconciliation. Maybe their parents, now grandparents, would come to appreciate the joy their grandchild brought into the world. They imagined their parents walking through the door, their faces softening, and their hearts opening to the child they had never truly acknowledged. But then the message came. The protagonist had sent the invitation weeks before, feeling a nervous excitement as they pressed send. After all, they had tried to keep the door open for their parents. Despite everything, they still wanted to believe in the possibility of a family bond. But the response they received shattered that hope. The message from their father was blunt, no room for sentiment, no softness in the words. "We won't recognize this grandchild." It felt like a slap to the face, even though there was no anger in the tone. It was cold, matter of fact, a decision that left no room for negotiation, no possibility of change. As the protagonist read those words over and over again, their heart began to sink. They had known, deep down, that their parents might not show up, but seeing it written so plainly, so decisively, hit harder than they ever could have imagined. The hurt was undeniable, but strangely, it wasn't the only emotion that surged through them. Beneath the sadness and disappointment, there was a growing sense of clarity, a quiet realization that this was it. This was the moment they had been avoiding, the moment they had feared for so long. Sitting in the quiet of their living room, the protagonist stared at their phone, processing the message. It felt as though the world around them had frozen for a moment. The first birthday of their child was supposed to be a time of joy, a time to celebrate, but it had become an emotional battlefield, forcing the protagonist to confront the very thing they had been avoiding, the painful reality of their family's indifference. The thoughts came rushing in, the reflections on everything they had endured over the years. The emotional cost of their parents' absence was immense. Every birthday, every holiday, every important moment in their life that had been overshadowed by their parents' refusal to be fully present. It was as though they had been living in a shadow, always striving for the love and acceptance that was never truly there. And now, this refusal, so final and absolute, was the punctuation at the end of a long sentence of neglect. But something shifted within them as they sat in silence. They realized, almost with surprise, that they weren't as devastated as they expected to be. Yes, there was pain, but there was also a strength rising within them that they hadn't fully recognized before. They had spent so many years seeking their parents' approval, hoping that one day things would change. But now, in this moment, they understood that they didn't need that approval anymore. The absence of their parents didn't define their worth. In fact, it was freeing. It was the beginning of their own journey, one where they no longer had to rely on the toxic validation that had been withheld from them for so long. The emotional weight that had been bearing down on the protagonist for years seemed to lift, replaced by a quiet sense of empowerment. They had given so much of themselves, only to be met with indifference. But now they knew that they could let go. They could stand tall, no longer carrying the burden of their family's expectations and rejection. When the moment came to confront their parents, the protagonist's response was calm, measured. There were no outbursts, no tears, just a simple, firm statement. "Okay, just don't ask me for money for your debts anymore." It was as if the words had been building up inside them for years, and they finally felt the power of speaking them out loud. Their father's laughter on the other end of the line didn't sting as much as it once would have. There was no anger in the protagonist's voice, just a sense of quiet dignity. The battle had already been won, not through shouting, not through drama, but through silence and strength. As the conversation ended, the protagonist felt a deep sense of finality. They had finally broken free, not in anger, but in calm, dignified defiance. It wasn't the dramatic confrontation they had once imagined, but it was better. The real surprise they knew was yet to come. The protagonists sat alone in the quiet of their home, the hum of daily life surrounding them, but there was a deep inner silence that felt more pronounced now than ever. Their mind was swirling with conflicting emotions, the kind that often arise when the heart is torn between old habits and the painful but necessary process of moving on. The weight of their parents' rejection hung heavily on their shoulders, but it was not just the words that stung, it was the years of emotional neglect, the constant feeling of being unwanted. They had never been good enough, not for their parents, not for the people they had loved and hoped would love them back. The absence of their parents at their child's first birthday was simply the most recent chapter in a long history of abandonment, manipulation, and betrayal. The protagonist's thoughts drifted back to the childhood they had once hoped would be different. They had been a quiet, sensitive child, always trying to please their parents, craving their attention and approval. It seemed like no matter how hard they tried, it was never enough. Their father had always been distant, too absorbed in his own world, while their mother had been critical, always finding something to disapprove of. In the moments when they had tried to open up, to share something important, their parents had often brushed them off, or worse, made them feel small for having needs. There were flashes of moments, though, that felt like love, times when their mother would embrace them, or when their father would briefly show a glimmer of pride in their accomplishments. But those moments were fleeting, quickly overshadowed by the coldness that came right after. As the protagonist reflected on those years, they began to realize something they had never allowed themselves to fully understand before. Their parents' love was conditional. It was always about their parents' expectations and never about the protagonist as an individual. The approval they had so desperately sought, the love they had hoped would one day be freely given, would never come. And now, as an adult, they could see it clearly. What had once been the driving force in their life was nothing more than a mirage. The realization stung, but it also came with a certain clarity. The protagonist had spent years trying to meet their parents' expectations, sacrificing their own happiness and identity in the process. And what had it gotten them? A life filled with emotional scars and an ongoing cycle of disappointment. Their parents had taught them that love was earned through performance, through appeasing others' desires, but the truth was far simpler. Love should never be conditional. As the emotional weight of this understanding settled over them, a new strength began to grow, an inner strength that didn't come from yelling, from fighting, or from pleading for recognition. No, the strength they felt now came from something deeper, something that had been buried under years of longing and hurt. It came from the quiet dignity of knowing they were enough, just as they were. They no longer needed their parents' approval to validate their worth. In fact, they realized they were better off without it. The internal conflict that had been gnawing at them for days, should they fight back or let go, seemed to dissolve in that moment. Fighting back would only feed into the toxic cycle, perpetuating the drama and the hurt. They had tried for so long to engage with their parents in a way that would make them see the protagonist for who they truly were, but it had never worked. The cycle was always the same: disappointment followed by a brief hope, only to be crushed again. The protagonist realized that in order to break free, they didn't need to fight back. They didn't need to waste any more energy on seeking a love that would never be given. What they needed was silence. Not silence out of fear, but silence out of strength. They knew the world would continue turning, whether or not their parents were involved in their life. Their child, the one they had worked so hard to raise with love and care, would be the focus of their attention from now on. The protagonist's decision had been made. They would no longer let their parents dictate the course of their life, no longer let their toxic presence shadow their every move. In the silence, they would find their power. As they reflected further, memories of their younger self, their yearning for approval, the deep sense of rejection, felt almost foreign to them now. They realized how much they had changed, how much they had grown. In this moment, the protagonist was not the fragile, longing child anymore. They were an adult, a parent, someone who had learned the hard way that the approval of others could never be the foundation of self-worth. The choice to remain silent, to walk away from the family dynamic that had once defined them, was an act of self-respect. They didn't need to scream or shout, to demand anything from their parents. They simply needed to refuse to participate in the toxic game they had been playing for far too long. No more explanations. No more begging for love. They had found a new kind of peace, one that came from within, and it was more powerful than anything they had ever experienced. As the protagonist moved forward, there was no anger, no bitterness, just a quiet, firm resolve to never let the toxic influence of their family shape their life again. The emotional dilemma was over. The decision had been made. And in that silence, they had found the strength to carry on, unburdened, free. The protagonist sat at their kitchen table, the quiet hum of their home almost unbearable. The silence wasn't just a lack of sound, but a reflection of the weight that had been building in their chest for weeks. They had always known their parents were financially unstable, but over the past few years, it had become a constant theme in their lives, one that they couldn't escape. Their parents' financial struggles were no longer a background issue. They were a regular presence, showing up at the most inconvenient times with their hands outstretched, asking for help. It started off small, with their parents asking for a little extra cash here and there. Just until payday, they'd say. It was easy to say yes in the beginning, to offer a helping hand. After all, they were family. But soon, the requests grew larger and more frequent. They needed help paying bills. Then it was for medical expenses. Next, it was for car repairs. And on and on. Every time they'd send the money, the requests would keep coming, but the gratitude was always fleeting. Their parents never truly seemed to understand the burden it placed on the protagonist, and it was clear that the financial help was expected, not appreciated. The protagonist began to feel the strain of it all. They worked hard to build their own life, to create a secure and stable environment for themselves and their child, only to watch their parents spiral deeper into debt. The more money they gave, the more they seemed to need. There was never an end in sight, and the requests were always urgent, never allowing them to catch a breath. They felt trapped, forced into a cycle of giving, yet their parents' situation never improved. What had started as a desire to help, out of love and family loyalty, soon began to feel like an unspoken obligation, an emotional blackmail that they could never escape. Each time their parents called, it wasn't just about the money, it was the underlying message that they were failing them. If they didn't send the money, they'd be branded as selfish, uncaring, or ungrateful. This dynamic had always existed, but it had been subtle, hidden behind the guise of family love and duty. Over time, the protagonist began to recognize it for what it was, manipulation. The turning point came when their parents called once more, this time asking for a large sum of money to cover a business venture they had invested in, a risky, poorly thought-out scheme. Their tone was urgent, demanding even, and the expectation was clear. They needed the money, and they needed it now. The protagonist listened, feeling a familiar wave of frustration building inside them. How could they possibly help them again? They had already given so much, and for what? The financial support was only ever temporary, and their parents were no closer to solving their problems. It was as if nothing would ever change, no matter how much money the protagonist poured into their problems. The realization hit them hard. The money was never the issue. It wasn't about paying off debts or fixing problems. It was about control. Their parents had learned to use money as leverage, a tool to manipulate them into submission. They had always been able to make the protagonist feel guilty, to make them think they were failing as a child, as a family member, whenever they said no. This guilt was the real burden, the one that kept them shackled, unable to break free. The protagonist's mind was made up. This time they would not cave in. They would not let themselves be controlled anymore. They didn't need to explain themselves or justify their decision. This was their life now, and they had worked hard to get to this point. The idea of constantly handing over money to support their parents' destructive patterns of behavior was no longer something they were willing to do. In a quiet, determined decision, they resolved to stop enabling them. They would no longer let their parents' financial problems dictate the course of their life. For the first time, they realized that saying no wasn't a reflection of their love or lack thereof. It was a necessary act of self-preservation. They had always felt guilty for not doing enough, for not being able to fix everything for their parents. But now they understood that it wasn't their responsibility to carry their parents' burdens. They had their own family to care for, their own future to build, and they couldn't continue to sacrifice their own stability just to appease them. With this new clarity, the protagonist decided to remain silent, to no longer engage in the emotional back and forth. They would not allow guilt to pull them back into that cycle. They would no longer take on the weight of their parents' problems or let them guilt-trip them into submission. In fact, they had learned that sometimes silence was the most powerful response. By not responding to their parents' requests, by choosing not to offer them any more financial help, they were taking control of their own life for the first time. It was a quiet, dignified act of defiance, but it felt like freedom. As they sat there, pondering their decision, they felt an inner strength growing. This wasn't about anger or vengeance, it was about growth. They had finally recognized that their worth wasn't tied to how much they could give, how much they could sacrifice for their parents' sake. It was time to take control, to live a life that was no longer dictated by guilt or manipulation. For the first time in a long while, the protagonist felt at peace, knowing that they were doing what was best for themselves, and that in the end was all they could do. The day of the birthday arrived, and the house was filled with warmth and laughter, the faint sound of children playing, and the soft hum of the birthday decorations swaying in the breeze. It was supposed to be a celebration, a moment of joy for their child, a first milestone in their life that would be cherished forever. Yet, as the day wore on, the protagonist felt a heaviness settling over them. The phone call from their parents that morning had been the final blow. "We're not coming," their father had said, his voice as cold and dismissive as ever. "We won't recognize this grandchild. You know, this isn't the way we raised you. You shouldn't be forcing us into this." The words hit harder than they had expected. It wasn't just the refusal to attend the birthday. It was the fact that their parents still viewed them as a disappointment, still unable to accept the decisions they had made in their life. They hadn't changed. They hadn't grown. They were still trapped in their old patterns, manipulating and controlling, trying to bend the protagonist to their will with guilt and shame. And now, they were using their grandchild as another tool in their emotional game. The protagonist took a deep breath, trying to push away the feelings of hurt that threatened to rise. For so long, they had tried to please their parents, to gain their approval, to prove that they were worthy of love. But now they knew better. They knew that no matter how hard they tried, it would never be enough. They had spent years trying to appease them, trying to be the child they wanted, only to find that it didn't matter. No amount of sacrifices, no amount of bending to their will, would ever make them truly proud of their child. And now, they realized something that had been gnawing at them for so long. They had been letting their parents control their life. Their child's first birthday should have been a celebration of new beginnings, of joy of the future. But their parents had twisted it into a reminder of everything that had been wrong in the past, the disappointment, the guilt, and the suffocating weight of their manipulation. As they stood there, the calmness settling in, the protagonist made a decision. They would no longer let their parents dictate their happiness, their life, or the future of their child. With a steady hand, they dialed their father's number. The phone rang, and they waited, knowing that the conversation ahead would not be easy. When their father answered, the protagonist spoke with a quiet but unwavering voice. "Okay," they said, their tone calm, almost too calm. "Just don't ask me for money for your debts anymore." The words hung in the air, simple and firm. There was no anger, no shouting, no dramatics. It wasn't a confrontation. It wasn't a threat. It was just the truth, delivered with the quiet power of someone who had finally found their voice. On the other end of the line, there was a pause. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then the father chuckled. "Oh, come on. You can't be serious. You'll come running to us when we need you. We know you." His laughter was dismissive, as if he was certain that the protagonist was only saying this in the heat of the moment, that they wouldn't follow through. He was used to their weakness, to their desperation to please him, and he thought nothing would change. He thought the protagonist would back down, as they always had before. But this time, there was something different. There was no fear in the protagonist's voice. No hesitation. They had made a decision, and they were no longer the person they used to be, the one who cowered under pressure, who gave in to guilt and manipulation. The protagonist felt a quiet surge of empowerment as their father continued to laugh on the other end. He didn't believe them. He thought they were bluffing. But the protagonist knew they weren't. They weren't afraid anymore. They didn't need their father's approval or validation. They didn't need to be his pawn in his endless cycle of emotional manipulation. They had something far more important now, a sense of self-worth that had been long buried under years of compromise and sacrifice. "No," the protagonist replied calmly. I mean it. I won't. The certainty in their voice was palpable, and for a brief moment, they could almost feel their father's surprise, the slight shift in his demeanor. There was no immediate response. The laughter stopped. The silence stretched on, and the protagonist held their ground, not feeling the need to say anything more. There was nothing more to say. In that moment, the protagonist realized just how far they had come. It wasn't just about money or their parents' refusal to attend their child's birthday. It was about reclaiming their power, their dignity in their own life. They didn't need to fight, didn't need to yell or demand respect. They had already won by simply choosing to stand firm in their decision. They were no longer bound by the toxic ties that had held them captive for so long. They had let go of the chains of guilt, of self-doubt, and of fear. It was an act of quiet rebellion, of self-preservation, and the protagonist knew, in that instant, that they would never go back to being the person they once were. This was the turning point. This was where their journey of growth truly began. The days after the phone call passed by slowly, but the protagonist felt a quiet sense of peace settling over them. Each day was an affirmation that they had made the right decision. They no longer felt the pull of their parents' toxic influence, no longer felt that underlying guilt trying to drag them back into their old ways. But there was one final step, a quiet, dignified gesture that would bring everything full circle. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. There would be no loud confrontations, no public shaming. Instead, it was something far more powerful. The protagonist knew that the only way to truly break free from the grip their parents had on them was to prove that they didn't need them. They didn't need their validation. They didn't need their approval. And most importantly, they didn't need to be used for their parents' financial gain any longer. A few weeks earlier, the protagonist had quietly finalized everything, legally, financially. The business, the assets, the investments. Every detail had been carefully arranged without their parents knowing. It was all done in silence, no fanfare, no announcements. It wasn't about showing off or flaunting their success. It was about freedom. They were finally in control of their life. And now, it was time for the final piece of the puzzle to fall into place. On the morning of the mailbox surprise, the protagonist felt a deep satisfaction as they quietly prepared for what was coming. They could already feel the quiet strength within them, a strength they had quietly built over the years, hidden beneath the surface. Their parents, still wrapped up in their own world, still unaware of what was unfolding, were about to receive a wake-up call. The protagonist had arranged for a life-changing document to be delivered to their mailbox. It was a legal notice, one that would completely change the course of their relationship with their parents, and one that would prove once and for all that they were no longer bound by the chains of manipulation and financial dependency. The protagonist didn't need to be there when the mail arrived. They already knew what would happen. The document would speak for itself. They would see it, read it, and in that moment they would understand the truth. The protagonist was no longer dependent on them, no longer living in their shadow. Their financial independence had been quietly achieved, and it had all been done without fanfare. As the mail arrived at their parents' house, the protagonist felt an undeniable sense of satisfaction. The document was now in their hands, and they would soon face the consequences of their actions. No more manipulation, no more control, just the quiet, undeniable truth of a life finally reclaimed. The moment the document arrived in their parents' mailbox, it was as if the entire universe had shifted. At first, there was no immediate reaction. They opened the envelope, probably thinking it was just another piece of paperwork they could try to ignore, another bill they would expect the protagonist to pay. But when they read the contents, reality hit them like a thunderclap. The document was a formal notification, one that severed any remaining ties. The protagonist had done it quietly, without fanfare. Their inheritance, once at the mercy of their parents' financial demands, was now entirely under their control. More than that, it outlined that their parents were no longer able to claim any part of their wealth. The financial dependency, the emotional manipulation, they were gone, cut off with a single stroke of the pen. As their parents processed the weight of what had just happened, something inside them seemed to break. They were now fully aware that they had no more claim over the protagonist's life. The phone calls, the pleas for money, the silent expectations of their constant support, they were all gone. The protagonist was free, but the most powerful part of it all wasn't the financial severing. It was the emotional realization. For the first time, their parents were truly alone in their own mess. There were no more calls for help, no more guilt trips, no more chances to manipulate or guilt trip the protagonist into sacrificing their own happiness for the sake of their parents. And it was in that silence, that calm absence, that the true weight of the betrayal finally hit them. The protagonist, from a distance, watched as karma unfolded. It wasn't loud. There were no shouts or public confrontations. There was no need. The quiet weight of their independence spoke louder than any argument could. The protagonist didn't revel in the parents' pain. They didn't gloat. Instead, they simply felt a deep sense of peace. They had learned that true power didn't come from loud confrontation or dramatic gestures. It came from standing firm in one's own strength and allowing time and the universe to take care of the rest. Looking back, the protagonist reflected on how far they had come. They had grown not through explosive moments of anger, but through quiet reflection, dignified silence, and firm resolve. Their strength didn't need to be validated by anyone else. And in the end, it was that quiet strength, that resilience in the face of adversity, that had set them free. As the protagonists sat in their quiet home, they allowed themselves the rare gift of reflection. The weight of everything that had happened seemed to fade into the background, replaced by an overwhelming sense of peace. They thought about all the years spent chasing approval, trying to please people who would never give them the love and validation they craved. They thought about the countless times they had been asked to sacrifice, to give up their own happiness for the sake of others. But now, in this moment, they realized something fundamental. The strength they had been seeking was never outside of them. It had always been within. They had built it, piece by piece, their every silent sacrifice, their every moment of pain when they chose to walk away instead of engage in toxic cycles. They had finally freed themselves from the emotional and financial chains that had bound them to their parents. And as they sat alone, surrounded by the peace of their own choices, they could see clearly they had made the right decision. The toxic people who once held sway over their life were no longer a part of their story. The protagonist had broken free, not by burning bridges with rage or seeking revenge in dramatic fashion, but by quietly choosing to walk away. They had learned to find their voice, not in anger or confrontation, but in their quiet actions. They realized that true peace didn't come from winning battles. It came from knowing that you had the strength to let go of what no longer served you. And in this final moment of introspection, the protagonist smiled softly, a tear escaping from the corner of their eye. It wasn't a tear of sadness, but of pride. They had learned that strength didn't always need to be loud, and peace didn't always need to be earned by fighting. Sometimes the greatest peace came simply from walking away and finding comfort in your own growth. With a deep breath, they stood up, walking towards the window and looking out the horizon. They had no need to look back anymore. The final lesson had been learned. As they stepped forward, they whispered to themselves, "I choose peace." And in that moment, they knew it was the right choice, one that would stay with them forever.